We ended the last episode lamenting the demise of my budget angle grinder that nonetheless had put in years of sterling service. But I'm not sentimental, and it's been fast forgotten. I have a new grinder. It's orange and has 50 more watts of power. I'm using it to ensure people are unaware of quite how bad I am at welding, but as you can see, the 3 cuts I made are now successfully glued back together again with molten steel. Once it's all flattened, I can imagine how it's going to look once ready for an epoxy coating. The steel was 8mm thick, and I do fear that my 100 amp welder is a little puny and might have been jointly the culprit for my electrode getting stuck, alongside my rookie technique. But the steel is now all back together, albeit with a handful of little gaps I couldn't fill for the life of me. Epoxy paste will come to the rescue. The whole purpose behind this particular sub-enterprise is clear to see. It's bent now, as Alan's transom is far from flat, and this bracket can't stick out. I only drilled the initial 4 holes prior to the bending, since the other 4 would probably end up in the wrong place if I marked them when the steel was still straight. But now I can zoom around and mark, pilot, and then drill the 4 holes. A total of 8 M12 bolts can support about 4 elephants plus a medium-sized rhinoceros, so I reckon it's enough since the bracket is there to support a small platform, a few humans brave enough to stand on it, plus a couple of electric outboard motors in an emergency. There we go, 8 holes, and none of them accidentally punched through into the foam-filled void. The large piece of steel isn't ready to be plonked onto the transom just yet, as there's been some very light corrosion, and even on delivery, it wasn't a bright, lightened steel. I want to give the epoxy and the sealant the best chance of staying put long term. So a flap wheel on the grinder brightens up most of the vertical rear face of the bracket, and then I went over with the sander for good measure. Finally, to make sure that we haven't left behind any dust, oils or other assorted grot, I gave it a wipe down with some acetone solvent. The transom needed some prep too, and at the moment that dull, near matte black coating is merely a couple of coats of high build epoxy primer. This is not the final hull finish. It's going to be going back to being orange, now I've discarded various anti-foul options. I don't want to stick the steel onto what's merely a coat of paint, so I'm gently grinding back to roughly halfway through the gel coat. It reveals the very outer layer of the fiberglass in a few patches, but this is fine so long as the surface is nicely roughed up and ready for what comes next. There's going to be sealant as well as the main face-to-face epoxy bond, and I'm sanding back the edges too so there's no glossy surface left in this zone. In front of this suspiciously positioned water bottle adorned with a medium-sized Allen sticker, which are available on my website, comes a double pot of epoxy paste. I did a lot of research about what sticky stuff to use for this steel to fiberglass job. Tons of mastics and epoxies claim to be the answer, but here I needed to combine inherent strength with a non-drippy consistency, able to really cling to the steel and without blowing the budget. It helps that this is specifically marketed to be used underwater too, which is a bonus even though it shouldn't ever get wet. Luckily it's a straightforward 1-to-1 ratio mix, and I'm using all of it, so I don't need to deploy the weighing scales, or get emotional about whether it's a weight or a volume mixing ratio, as some makers of sticky guns seem to condemn us to endure. So I had fun mixing that together with a mixing thingy, and then eyeballed the spreading out phase. I'm keeping it away from the bolt holes, and also the edges as I don't want epoxy to squeeze into either the holes or from the top, bottom, left or right. The reason is that I'm using a flexible polyurethane sealant to go around the bolt holes and around the 4 sides. I feel that this belt and braces approach will mean that we don't come a cropper should there be any flex caused by people standing on the stern platform. On it goes, and I'm popping all the bolts through at this stage to make sure they all poke through okay, but I'm not tightening them all up with nylock nuts just yet, as I want the bond to cure before carefully making the final bolted assembly complete with sealant. So instead I've used standard non-locking bolts for now, and utilising my special jam spanner technique for tightening the bolts, whilst unable to be both inside and outside the boat concurrently. Someone should really invent something far better for solo bolt work, and don't say just use another human being. The tightening causes a little oozing, which is fine, and in one small area a little epoxy adhesive has emerged, which isn't what I wanted, but I think will survive. In some areas the pre-squirted sealant hasn't oozed out, so we'll need some more sealant added around the 4 sides so it's a strong, thick, liberal seal. Water getting around the back, even with the tight fit and with all that epoxy, will attack the steel, and we don't want that. Once cured after a couple of days, I can apply a nice neat coat of epoxy primer and top coat before mounting things to it. And like a responsible boatyard dweller, I clear up the mess. Shame about the plastic waste, but cleaning them out with lots of solvent and rag is like 156 of one and 13 dozen of another. I've been meaning to do this for a while. We discovered that on sea trials, we used up the limited space on the mooring posts, so I'm adding one on the port side to keep the other stern end post company. Drilling the 4 holes may strike you as elementary, but Alan's construction comprises a whole load of foam-filled insulation and buoyancy voids that are hard to predict by looking from either inner and outer angles and guessing the dimensions. So it's fortunate that these holes ended up breaking into the accessible zone beneath and not into a foamy void. Inside, this is a DIY foam insulated area, which is easy enough to slice out with a sharp knife. I don't want sealant everywhere, so some masking tape goes down, and then due to the shape of the underside of the post, I'm using the polyurethane mastic on the deck and not directly on the steel. Duly plonked down, I'm adding a little bead around the top of the threads of the bolts so they seal those channels, but don't make a mess of the lower half of the threads that need to accept the clean washer and a nylock nut. I like these oversized washers when clamping things to fiberglass. Even if it's solid fiberglass and not wood or foam cord, it seems like common sense to widen the surface area and avoid any compression damage to the laminate. Some slightly awkward spanner action later and we have success. It's less than likely that this mooring post is going to ping off and drop into the ocean. I kept the piece of sliced out insulation as it was still in good nick and could go straight back in and get resealed with some foil tape. You'd never know anything had happened here. Unless you looked. Right then, another episode due very soon for you, so back to the editing dungeon for me. Bye.